You are doing 2 week sprints. You have a Jira board. You call it Agile. But somehow, every single project still takes 6 months and nobody saw the problems coming until week 10. I have been building software for over a decade. I have worked on teams that did proper Agile. I have worked on teams that called everything Agile but were absolutely, structurally, spiritually waterfall. And the tricky thing is, the second type usually doesn't know it. They have done the training. They have the Confluence pages. Someone went to a safe certification course and came back with a lanyard and a lot of energy. But the ceremonies are just theater if the underlying assumptions haven't changed. Waterfall is not really about Gantt charts. It is about believing that you can fully know what you're building before you build it, and that the job of the team is to execute a plan rather than discover a solution. That belief survives certification courses. It survives Jira. It even survives the daily stand-up. Here are 7 signs it's surviving at your company right now. Let's start with the most obvious one, because it happens in plain sight and nobody calls it out. Your sprint planning is just requirements. Gathering with a timer. Real sprint planning should take maybe 2 hours for a 2-week sprint. You look at the backlog is already refined, stories are reasonably sized, the team asks clarifying questions and commits to what they can actually deliver. That's it. But if your sprint planning regularly runs 4, 5, 6 hours, and you spend that time writing acceptance criteria from scratch, arguing about what the feature is supposed to do, waiting for a product manager to call a business stakeholder on speakerphone to answer a question that should have been answered 3 weeks ago, that is not sprint planning. That is a requirements workshop. You just put it inside a sprint cadence and called it Agile. The tell is when stories arrive at planning with no clear definition of done. Because in actual waterfall, requirements are written up front. In fake Agile, they get written under pressure, in the meeting, which is somehow worse. Here's another one that drives me crazy, mostly because it's dressed up as due diligence. The architecture was decided before any code was written. Now look, I'm not saying you shouldn't think about architecture. You absolutely should. But there is a difference between setting sensible constraints early and doing a full 6-week design phase where a small committee produces a 40-page technical architecture document that the development team is then handed like a set of blueprints. That is waterfall. The document might reference microservices. It might mention Kubernetes and event-driven architecture and all the right buzzwords. But if the team had no meaningful input, if there is no room to adapt as you learn, if deviating from the document requires a formal change request, you are not doing Agile. You are building a cathedral. Agile assumes you will learn things mid-build that change your understanding. If your architecture cannot bend at all, your process won't either. The document becomes the thing you protect instead of the product. Number 3, and this one's subtle until it isn't. Velocity is treated as a delivery commitment. Velocity in Scrum is a planning tool. It tells you roughly how much work a team can absorb in a sprint based on historical data. It is deliberately fuzzy. Story points are not hours. They are not a contract. But the moment your velocity number gets reported upward, something shifts. Now the VP of product is asking why velocity dropped from 42 to 31 last sprint. Now the team is inflating estimates to keep the number stable. Now engineers are cutting corners on testing to hit the point count because a story is technically done, even if it isn't really done. Once velocity becomes a performance metric, the team stops using it to forecast and starts using it to perform. That is not Agile. That is the same output over outcome thinking that Waterfall runs on, just with a different spreadsheet. And the Jira burn down chart looks fine right up until the release date, when everything falls apart at once. Moving on. And this one is so common, it has basically become the default. Sprints are phases, not iterations. In a real iterative process, every sprint produces something potentially shippable. The whole point is that you are delivering value incrementally, learning from each delivery and adjusting. That is what makes it agile. But watch what actually happens on a lot of teams. Sprint 1 is discovery and design. Sprint 2 and 3 are back-end development. Sprint 4 is front-end integration. Sprint 5 is QA and bug fixes. Sprint 6 is hardening. That is a waterfall project cut into 6 pieces and labeled with sprint numbers. Nothing ships until sprint 6. The QA team has nothing to test until week 8. The feedback loop, the thing that makes iterative development valuable, is completely broken. You could remove the sprint structure entirely, and the project timeline would not change. The dead giveaway is when your done column in Jira means done with this phase rather than actually in front of users. This next one is the one nobody talks about because it's uncomfortable. Retrospectives don't actually change anything. The retrospective is arguably the most important ceremony in Scrum. It is the mechanism by which the team improves. Without it functioning properly, everything else is just going through the motions. But here is what happens on most teams. You do the retro. Someone writes better communication on a sticky note. Someone else writes clearer requirements. The Scrum Master types it all up. It goes into Confluence. Nobody reads it next sprint. The same issues appear in the next retro. Repeat for 18 months. In a waterfall project, there is typically a lessons learned meeting at the end. One meeting, after the whole thing is done. In fake Agile, you have that same meeting every 2 weeks, but with the same outcome. The observations never become actual changes to how the team works. If your retro action items have a lower completion rate than your sprint tickets, you do not have a continuous improvement culture. You have a complaint forum with a time slot. Here's one that should be obvious, but apparently isn't. Customers and users don't appear until UAT. One of the core promises of Agile is that you stay close to the people you are building for. You build something, you show it, you get feedback, you adjust. The feedback loop is short. That is the whole point. But on Waterfall in Disguise teams, real users show up exactly once, right at the end. It is called user acceptance testing, and it is identical to the Waterfall UAT phase. Same gate, same purpose, same consequences when it fails. Product managers write user stories in a room without users. Designers do wireframes without testing them with anyone real. Engineers build to spec for 3 months. Then UAT arrives, and someone's actual customer logs in and says, "This is not how we work at all." And suddenly, you have a scope conversation 2 weeks before go live. Agile is supposed to make that impossible by involving users continuously. If the first time a real person touches your product is in a formal testing phase, the process was waterfall. The stand-up just made it harder to see. And finally, the last sign, and honestly the biggest one, because it sets the ceiling for everything else. The roadmap is a fixed contract disguised as a plan. A roadmap in Agile is supposed to be directional. Here is where we think we are going. Here is what we believe is valuable, subject to change as we learn. That word, directional, is doing a lot of work. But in most organizations, the roadmap is a commitment. It was presented to stakeholders in Q1. It has dates on it. Those dates were probably in a deck that went to the board. And now, the Agile team is executing against a fixed scope, fixed timeline, fixed feature list, while doing stand-ups and sprints to make it look adaptive. When a team discovers mid-project that a feature isn't actually what users need, and they have to build it anyway because it's on the roadmap, that is waterfall. When an engineer raises a technical risk in a retro and nothing changes because the date cannot move, that is waterfall. The sprints are just the way the work is organized, not the way decisions get made. If the roadmap can't flex, the process won't either. That's the root of almost everything else on this list. Look, waterfall is not evil. For certain kinds of projects, certain levels of regulatory constraint, certain team structures, a more sequential process makes sense. The problem is pretending you are doing something you are not, because that means you get the overhead of Agile ceremonies without any of the actual benefits. Your team does stand-ups and retros and sprint reviews on top of a process that was never actually designed to adapt. That is exhausting and demoralizing. Engineers eventually learn that the ceremonies are theater and they stop engaging. The Scrum Master chases compliance. The product manager writes Jira tickets that nobody believes in. If any of these 7 signs hit home, the fix is not more process. It is an honest conversation about what your organization actually wants, Because Agile only works if leadership is genuinely willing to let the plan change. If that's not on the table, at least be honest about what you are doing. If this hit home, you know what to do. Drop a comment with the sign that describes your team most accurately. And subscribe if you want more of this energy.